The Beatles' Help is a fascinating chapter in music history. With Revolver and Rubber Soul looming in the future, Help and the previous A Hard Day's Night mark the Beatles' middle period, a time where thoughtful, emotional, and even painful compositions were becoming the standard instead of the exception. Songs like Yesterday, You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, and of course the title track, Help, created one lovely album. Today, we're going to show you 10 very interesting facts about the Beatles album Help. Let's do this. This was a strange time for the Beatles, and thankfully John Lennon was usually so keen on being candid about his emotions. They had the fame and money, but things were still off for John. Generally regarded as the peak of the Beatles' fame, John was mired with insecurity, even bemoaning his weight gain. John says, "The whole Beatles thing was just beyond comprehension. I was eating and drinking like a pig, and I was fat as a pig, dissatisfied with myself, and subconsciously I was crying for help. So it was my fat Elvis period." You see, the movie, is very different, very insecure, and he's completely lost himself. And I'm singing about when I was so much younger and all the rest. Looking back at how it was, John never seemed to garner happiness from fame and fortune, but it is said being honest and open about your pain can be almost medicinal. Maybe he was so forthcoming in his life because he found it cathartic. That little exclamation mark has such a silly story behind it. Help's film director Richard Lester said that when the movie was being prepared under the unimaginative working title Beatles 2, the writers and Lester wanted to call it Help. No added punctuations. Unfortunately, they were informed by copyright lawyers that someone else had already registered that title. So, after Ringo's suggestion of 8 Arms to Hold You, referencing the deity in the film to an unenthusiastic response, they rang the lawyers up again and asked them if the other movie's title had an exclamation in it. The lawyer said no, and boom, that's how Help got its exclamation mark, and possibly what influenced John to make it sound like an explosive holler in the chorus. A lesser-known move on behalf of the Beatles that Brian Epstein made was shutting down the idea of the lads branching off with solo records while they were the Beatles, maintaining the integrity of the group. When Paul was recording Yesterday, the song that had no other Beatles members on it, George Martin recalls how quickly Brian dismissed the solo idea. George said to Brian, "You know, this is Paul's song. Shall we call it Paul McCartney?" He said, "No. Whatever we do, we are not splitting up the Beatles." So even though none of the others appeared on the record, it was still the Beatles. That was the creed of the day. I'm going to do an episode on Brian Epstein. He might not have been musical, but he sure was brilliant. Now this is a big shift. Instead of recording a bunch of takes by the entire band and choose the best ones to edit, the Beatles began to record the rhythm track first and adding vocals, overdubs, and other instruments later, a method that is the industry standard up till now. This was also the time they introduced reduction mixing, meaning a 4-track tape was consolidated to a copy in which it freed up a spare track for overdubs. By using reduction mixing, it allowed the Beatles to be more adventurous when recording. See, there are always these tiny things that blossom into why these songs were so great. We never really hear too much confrontation from George Martin. Always such a gentleman, full of class, it's hard to think anyone would have trouble getting along with him. However, George and the film's director were not exactly friends. George says, "I produced all the tracks for the film, but I wasn't asked to do the scoring. Another guy was offered the job. Dick Lester and I didn't hit it off well on A Hard Day's Night, and the fact that I got an Academy Award nomination for musical direction probably didn't help either." Even when talking about not getting along with someone, George still maintains his iconic level of professional decorum. Obviously, India had a massive influence on the lads from Liverpool, especially George, but interestingly, they were exposed to the East right there on set for the first time. John recalls, saying, "The first time that we were aware of anything Indian was when we were making Help, and on the set in one place they had sitars and things. They were the Indian band playing in the background, and George was looking at them." Then, about 2 years later, George had started getting into Hatha Yoga. He got involved in Indian music from looking at the instruments on the set, all from that crazy movie. Long before Matthew McConaughey was driving a Lincoln before he was paid to, Lincoln Mercury, 15 years after the Beatles split in 1985, paid £100,000 for the right to use Help in a commercial, making it the first Beatles song to be licensed for this use. George Martin helped create a Beatles-like version of the song by a sound-alike group, as the license did not include the Beatles recording. Photographer Robert Freeman, who had previously worked on the album covers for With the Beatles, A Hard Day's Night, and Beatles for Sale, had an interesting idea for Help. He says, I had the idea of semaphore spelling out the letters help, but when we came to do the shot, the arrangement of the arms with those letters didn't look good, so we decided to improvise and ended up with the best graphic positioning of the arms. If translated, the Beatles are spelling N-U-J-V in semaphore. I wonder what it would have looked like if it had said help. There are two covers on Help, the first being Dizzy Miss Lizzy, and the second is Ringo's Act Naturally. Act Naturally was the Beatles' last cover recording all the way until the Let It Be sessions in 1969. They used to need covers to help sell records, but by this point they were the band other people wanted to cover. John wasn't too kind towards the Beatles' catalog years after they broke up, but he did love a few songs, one of them being Help. In a 1970 interview, one of his last interviews, John remarks on how honest Help really was. He says, "The only true song I ever wrote were Help and Strawberry Fields. They were the ones I really wrote from experience and not projecting myself into a situation and writing a nice story about it, which I always found phony. The lyric is as good now as it was then. It makes me feel secure to know that I was that sensible, aware of myself back then. That was with no acid, no nothing. Well, pot." That's all for today, everyone. I'm really digging making these types of videos. I've been moving around quite a bit, literally across the states, but now that I'm settled, I intend to get back in front of the camera like we did when we started this whole thing. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks so much for watching, and special thanks to contributing author Leah Robbins. Be sure to check out some of our other videos on music, such as Why Did Freddie Mercury Write Bohemian Rhapsody?, The Story Behind Toto's Africa, and if you're a Beatles fan, well, let's just say this is your channel. Thanks to the amazing patrons who keep this channel alive, and if you're into super underground music, then definitely check out the Hollyhobs on Spotify, Apple Music, and everywhere music is streamed. If you want to be notified when new videos are out, at this point you'll have to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and pray that YouTube will recommend anything you actually might want to see. If you have an idea for a video, please be sure to leave a comment. See you next time.